Hello and welcome to this Oklahoma State Historic Preservation Office workshop. Today's presentation is Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. I'm Christina Wyckoff. I'm the Section 106 coordinator and historical archaeologist with the Oklahoma SHPO. So we'll get started. So an overview of this presentation will briefly discuss the National Historic Preservation Act, Section 106 and the four-step review process, agreement documents, program alternatives, preparing a submittal for our review at the Oklahoma SHPO, and emergency reviews relating specifically to 36 CFR 800.12 and also to the executive order about energy emergencies. So the National Historic Preservation Act was enacted by the 89th U.S. Congress and signed into law by President Lyndon B. Johnson in 1966. The law, or the act, established a partnership between the federal government and state, tribal, and local governments, and that supported federal funding for preservation activities. Among the many things that NHPA does, it authorized the National Register of Historic Places, created the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, created the State Historic Preservation Offices, and then later by amendment, Tribal Historic Preservation Offices, and established consideration of historic preservation as part of the federal planning process. NHPA was born in response to the loss and alteration of significant historic resources, largely due to federal projects, including things like National Interstate and Defense Highways Act of 1956, Housing Act of 1949, Housing and Urban Development Acts of 1965 and 1968, but also many others. Basically, federal developments that in creating new things that were considered important did not consider and often destroyed or removed very significant historical resources. And with heritage so rich, a report that was produced for Congress when NHPA was being considered, there are a number of just really lovely tributes to the importance of our historical resources. And this, Images of Tradition by George Zabriskie, says, without some relics, the total past becomes less than a myth, neither useful nor believable, but only a sense of unknown loss of knowledge which might exist, a vanished world left for conjecture of imagined cities in the sun. So NHPA said the spirit and direction of the nation are founded upon and reflected in its historic heritage. The historical and cultural foundations of the nation should be preserved as a living part of our community life and development in order to give a sense of orientation to the American people. And historic properties significant to the nation's heritage are being lost or substantially altered, often inadvertently, with increasing frequency. So these are the things that were important to the 89th Congress and the people who, the citizens who pushed for this legislation at that time. So to carry out federal historic preservation programs in Oklahoma, our office, like SHPOs across the nation, follow the regulations, standards, and guidelines of the National Park Service and the regulations and guidance of the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. And so that sort of background brings us to Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act, which is the central focus of this presentation. Section 106 requires federal agencies consider the effects of their projects on historic properties. A historic property is any building, structure, object, site, or district listed in or eligible for listing on the National Register of Historic Places. And this Section 106 gives communities, preservationists, and the public a voice in the federal planning process. Federal projects can and do impact significant resources. And with Section 106, there's an opportunity to advocate for those resources before they're demolished or impacted. The Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, or ACHP, regulations detail the steps and timeframes for this process. They're detailed in 36 CFR Part 800, which you can also find attached here in the handouts at the right side of your screen. Section 106 is a procedural law. It is not a substantive law. That is to say that it dictates that a certain process be followed, not a particular outcome. Under Section 106, federal agencies must do these things. They must consult with others, including the SHPO, TIPO, tribes, and the public, and they must complete the Section 106 review process before making a decision on a project. Federal agencies must also provide the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation with an opportunity to comment on their projects. And they remain responsible for all findings and eligibility determinations. This is a quick note about anticipatory demolition, which is under Section 110K of the National Historic Preservation Act, but is directly related to Section 106. So Section 110K prohibits a federal agency from granting a loan, permit, license, or other assistance to an applicant who, with intent to avoid the requirements of Section 106, intentionally, significantly, adversely affects the historic property to which the grant would relate, or having power to prevent it, allowed such significant adverse effect to occur prior to completion of a Section 106 review. And this section is intended to prevent people from deliberately destroying resources that they would have to account for in the Section 106 process. And this is just a reminder and a note. Do not begin your demolition, construction, or other work prior to completion of the Section 106 review by the federal agency. You should confirm with the federal agency that that review is complete, because to do so may make it much more difficult for you to get your money, or may prevent it altogether. A couple of definitions that are related to Section 106 and critical in understanding the process. The first is the area of potential effect, or APE. This is the geographic area or areas within which an undertaking, a federal project, may cause alterations in the character or use of historic properties. This is the area you have to look at, and you are requesting consulting parties to review. An adverse effect to a historic property is found when an undertaking may alter, directly or indirectly, any of the characteristics of a historic property that qualify that property for inclusion in the National Register in a manner which would diminish the integrity of the property's location, design, setting, materials, workmanship, feeling, or association. In short, this is any effect that makes a property lessens a property's ability to communicate its integrity. So let's discuss the four-step Section 106 process, which in theory is really quite simple. The four steps are: 1, you initiate the process; 2, you identify historic properties; 3, you assess whether there are adverse effects to any historic properties; and 4, if there are adverse effects, you resolve them. These are the four steps. Most projects do not require all four steps of the process because most projects have no historic properties that would be affected. And of those, many of them have no adverse effects to historic properties. But this process accounts for all possible situations that you might encounter. So let's go through these each one. Step 1, initiating the process, is about determining what your project is and who needs to be involved, and then involving those people. So you're going to define your project. You're going to determine whether it constitutes an undertaking. And we'll go into that definition in a moment. You're going to identify who the responsible federal agency is, because the agency is the entity responsible for this process. You're going to identify who you need to be consulting with, who are your consulting parties, and then you're going to determine whether or not you can initiate the consultation, and if not, who needs to do that. So a federal undertaking, for the purposes of Section 106, is a project involving federal funding, federal lands, a federal license or permit, or other federal assistance. So if you're getting money, if you're doing a project that's on federal property, or if you're getting some other federal assistance, then you have a federal undertaking. If you are unsure if you have a federal undertaking, if your project is a federal undertaking, then the federal agency who would have some involvement in the process would be the entity you would go to confirm that. The federal agency is responsible for determining whether their project is an undertaking. So let's just talk about some examples. The federal government has historically funded tons of different projects, and these can look a lot of different ways. They also permit or license projects. So let's just talk about some of these projects that might be subject to Section 106. One, or a home rehabilitation using grant funding provided through the Department of Housing and Urban Development. The housing and urban development funding is what we would say federal nexus. So that's the federal involvement in project A. That would mean it is a federal undertaking. So yes, that would be a federal undertaking. B, construction of a privately funded, so no federal funding, a privately funded housing development on private land, so the land is not federal, that may impact a wetland environment. And for that reason, a U.S. Army Corps of Engineers permit is required. So although no federal funding and no federal lands, the need for a permit issued by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is the federal nexus for this project, which would mean that this project B would be subject to Section 106 review. So C, construction of a new cell tower requiring a Federal Communications Commission permit or an FCC permit. This project would also be subject to Section 106 review because of the requirement for that FCC permit. D, a roadway improvement using some Federal Highways Administration funding would be subject to Section 106 review because the Federal Highways Administration funding is the federal nexus. So E is the one exception here. This is a privately funded rehabilitation project for a home that happens to be listed on the National Register of Historic Places. So I put this one in here just to show sort of like a gotcha question. But because a property that is on the National Register of Historic Places is not just always subject to Section 106 review. It would only be subject to review if there were some federal involvement. And in this instance, we're assuming that there is no other federal involvement in this project. Whatever the rehabilitation work that's being done, it's entirely privately funded. So despite the fact that this home has been identified as listed on the National Register of Historic Places and is thus a historic property, privately funded work at this home is not subject to Section 106 review. So just back here again, just to reiterate some of this. Step one, you're determining what the project is and who is involved. You're defining it. You've figured out that it's an undertaking. You've identified who the responsible federal agency is, and you need your consulting parties and to determine who can initiate. So I want to bring up here that the State Historic Preservation Office would, in many cases, is the entity that you would be required to consult with for your project within a state. However, There are tribal historic preservation offices, which were established by the 1992 amendments to NHPA. And a tribal historic preservation office may assume some or all of the duties for historic preservation on projects that are occurring on tribal lands. So if your project is on tribal lands, you may be consulting with the TIPO in place of the SHPO. You may not consult with the SHPO office at all for certain projects. Um, so it's important to know who the TIPOs are and whether or not your project is on tribal land. You can find information about TIPOs, especially I'm emphasizing TIPOs in the state of Oklahoma because this is the Oklahoma SHPO. You can find information on TIPOs through the Park Service website or through NATHPO. You can also find information on tribal governments and Section 106 consultation on our website at okhistory.org/SHPO/tribal 106. You can also find in the handouts a link directly to that website. So there may be instances when both the SHPO and the TIPO will be involved in a project. So let's talk about when the TIPO is assuming the role of a SHPO on tribal land. It's still possible that the SHPO might be asked to participate or may need to participate in a project. And there are 3 defined instances where this would be the case. The first is simply that the TIPO invites the SHPO participation, and this does happen. So if a TIPO requests that the SHPO provide a comment on a project, we certainly would do so. The SHPO would also participate if the undertaking on tribal lands is going to have an effect to historic properties located off of tribal lands. So your area of potential effect is perhaps going to extend beyond the limits, the boundary of the reservation or the tribal lands area. And the third is SHPO participation may be requested by a non-tribal member who owns land within the exterior boundaries of a reservation. But in this instance, the SHPO's comment would only apply regarding that property, the property of the non-tribal member with land within the exterior boundaries of the reservation. So then let's talk about who can actually initiate Section 106 consultation. So Section 106 is the responsibility of the federal agency. So the federal agency official may absolutely initiate Section 106 consultation with our office and with others. A responsible entity for many HUD programs, that would be like a city, a municipality, or a tribe that would operate with they would be responsible for the entirety of the 106 process for these HUD projects where they are designated as a responsible entity or an authorized representative of the federal agency. So a federal agency can delegate authority to another entity to initiate Section 106 consultation. This may be a consultant. This may be another agency, a state agency, perhaps. It can be any number of folks, but there has to be an official designation or delegation of that authority. So this is an example of a delegation, of a pretty broad delegation of authority from NTIA, the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, to the recipients of some of their grant funding. This in particular is for IFA grants for a couple of different projects, a couple of different big programs for broadband infrastructure. Okay, so I'm looking at the process again. This is step 1 that we've been discussing. Just define your project, determine who's responsible for it, and who you need to contact, and contact them. Let's go to step 2. After we've figured out what our project is, we need to figure out what the boundaries, what area we actually need to look at for this project. So we're defining our APE, or our area of potential effect. And this is defining the boundaries of the area that our project might affect. And then we're going to identify and assess any properties within that area. Some of the properties we're immediately going to look at are properties that have been listed or determined eligible for the National Register, but also properties that have not been assessed for National Register eligibility. The size and shape of our area of potential effect is going to be influenced by the scale and nature of an undertaking. Um, so a project for rehabilitation work, HUD-funded rehabilitation work on a home may just be the house itself, whereas a project to construct transmission lines has visual impacts and physical impacts. So the excavation of the structures, the towers that would run along this transmission line, the height at which these lines are going to be visible, all of those things would impact the definition of our area of potential effect. And an area of potential effect can be something very small or it can be something very large because, again, Section 106 covers a wide variety of projects. Also, please note that your area of potential effect could change during the Section 106 review process if new effects are identified through consultation or if the undertaking is modified. So you may start out with one idea of what your area of potential effect is, and you may determine that you have a historic property that is partially within your area of potential effect and extends without, and that your APE needs to be broadened to include that entire property, or you may determine that project effects are changed as you consult with parties and you think that actually your APE is much smaller than it was previously thought to be. Um, so once you have defined an area of potential effect, you're going to identify any historic properties within it. And what is required under Section 106 in identifying historic properties in your APE? The language of Section 106, the language says that the agency official shall make a reasonable and good faith effort. A reasonable and good faith effort. This would constitute background research, consultation, potentially oral history interviews, a sample field investigation or field survey, and this will vary depending on the nature and scope of your project. So again, if your project is a rehabilitation of a house or installation of new sewer sanitation utilities at a home site, it's very small in size and scope. Whether or not there, you may not need any archaeological survey. You may not need much in the way of background research. You may really just need to identify this footprint of this place and submit it for review to identified consulting parties who can tell you whether or not there's a potential concern. What is not required under step 2, identifying historic properties in the APE. So again, what is required is a reasonable and good faith effort. What is not required, you are not required to receive approval of the SHPO or TIPO. You are not required to identify every historic property in the APE. You are not required to investigate beyond or below a properly documented APE. And you are not required to ground verify the entirety of your APE. Federal projects can sometimes be incredibly large, and so a reasonable and good faith effort may be may not be a full excavation of an entire um, path of a project or footprint of a project. But again, it's important that consultation occur. So your consultation with these different parties that have been identified will help determine whether or not there are concerns within your APE that should be investigated. So if you have, if you identify properties in your APE, then you need to evaluate their historical significance and integrity, apply the National Register criteria, and determine if those properties in your APE are eligible for inclusion in the National Register. So you can check out my coworker's presentation on National Register on our YouTube channel, or the presentation that he just gave yesterday on Big Marker should still be available through our website. Um, but if you identify historic properties in your APE, then you do need to evaluate them for National Register eligibility. So at the conclusion of step 2, there are 2 possibilities. One, you may determine that there are no historic properties affected. And so if the agency documents that this is their finding, they seek the concurrence of the SHPO or TIPO and other consulting parties, and there's a 30-day review and comment period. And so the SHPO, TIPO, and other consulting parties can say, we see the information that you've supplied, and we either agree or disagree with your finding that there are no historic properties affected. At the end of step 2, you could also have identified historic properties. So if there is a historic property that you've identified, then you would notify the consulting parties. And again, you would proceed to step 3. So if there are no historic properties affected, the first of these 2 options, you find no historic properties affected, you consult with the SHPO or TIPO and other parties, and you receive concurrence from the SHPO and or TIPO and other tribes and other consulting parties, or no objections, then your Section 106 review is completed at the end of step 2. That does happen quite frequently. However, if historic properties are affected, you do need to proceed to step 3. So again, we initiated the process, we identified historic properties. 3, we've identified some historic properties in our APE, so now we need to assess whether there are adverse effects to those historic properties. So to do that, we apply the criteria of adverse effects, which is found at 36 CFR 800.5A1. You can find in my handouts, I have included 36 CFR Part 800. So if you don't already have that, you can find it there. So you apply the criteria of adverse effects and you consult. Consult with SHPO, TIPO, tribes, and other parties, and you involve the public. So an adverse effect, as I mentioned before, an adverse effect to a historic property is found when an undertaking may alter any of the characteristics of a historic property that qualify the property for inclusion in the National Register in a manner that diminish the integrity of the property. Some examples of adverse effects include demolition or physical destruction. So if you demolish a historic property, that's obviously an adverse effect. Alterations that are not consistent with the Secretary of the Interior standards are also an adverse effect. Removal of a historic property is an adverse effect. A change in use could be an adverse effect. Altering the setting could be an adverse effect. Adding new intrusive elements would be an adverse effect. And also, neglect of a historic property is an adverse effect. And transfer out of federal ownership is also considered an adverse effect. And the reason for the last, for transfer out of federal ownership, is that once a property is not owned by the federal government, then if it is owned, then when it is no longer owned by the federal government, then Section 106 would not necessarily apply to projects that would impact that property. And for that reason, it has to be considered an adverse effect. So at the end of step 3, what you're determining is whether or not your project is going to adversely affect or is likely to adversely affect historic properties in your area of potential effect. And so the 2 possible conclusions are that there is no adverse effect to historic properties. The agency would document this finding, share it with all consulting parties for a 30-day review and comment period, and involve the public. If the consulting parties concur that there is no adverse effect, then the Section 106 review of this project would be complete at the end of step 3. However, if the agency determines that there are adverse effects to historic properties, or if through consultation with the consulting parties, adverse effects to historic properties are acknowledged, then it's necessary to proceed to the fourth step and to resolve those adverse effects. And just a note, delegating Section 106 consultation to an applicant or a state agency or another party does not include the resolution of adverse effects to historic properties. The federal agency remains responsible for all findings and eligibility determinations, and only the federal agency can conclude the Section 106 process in cases of adverse effect findings. This is to keep the government accountable for their projects and impacts to historic properties. So we determine our project and make sure that we're consulting with all the folks we need to. We figured out what our area of potential effect was and identified any historic properties within it. We assessed adverse effects to some of those historic properties in our area of potential effect, and now we need to resolve adverse effects. To do this, we must develop and evaluate alternatives or modifications that would avoid, minimize, or mitigate adverse effects. A federal agency, must notify the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, the ACHP, and invite their participation in consultation. Often the Advisory Council will not immediately participate in consultation, but will keep that option available to them if there are problems in resolving adverse effects in the federal agency and the SHPO or TIPO or other parties in resolving those adverse effects. The ACHP may come back into consultation at that point. And so all parties will continue consultation to develop and evaluate alternatives or modifications. The SHPO, TIPO, tribes, and other consulting parties will be involved and ultimately will reach an agreement to resolve adverse effects. So this is what usually happens. You may have an adverse effect to a historic property, so you figure out some way that you can mitigate that adverse effect, or some modification to the project you can make to avoid it or to minimize it. Delegating Section 106 consultation, again, does not include resolution of adverse effects because the federal agency is responsible for all findings and eligibility determinations and must conclude the Section 106 process in cases of adverse effect findings. So ultimately, you will likely have a resolution with the consulting parties. You'll find a way to mitigate or minimize the adverse effect to historic properties in your area of potential effect. However, the law does provide for a situation where no agreement could be reached. And in that instance, the federal agency consults with the advisory council, or they receive formal advisory comments from the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. And the agency considers those comments in determining whether or not to proceed with their project. Ultimately, the federal agency is documenting each step of this process to demonstrate that they have followed the process, but they're making the determinations about their projects. So resolution of adverse effects is completed with the execution signing of an agreement document. This would be a memorandum of agreement. But there are other agreement documents. They're programmatic agreements, and we're just going to talk about these agreement documents briefly. So agreement documents are legally binding documents in which a project, the lead federal agency, and other signatory parties and their roles are identified, and stipulations are explicitly described, and responsible parties are identified. The two types of agreement documents are a memorandum, or the two most common are a memorandum of agreement, which is often used to document mitigation of known or defined adverse effects of a federal undertaking. Also, the other most common type of agreement document is a programmatic agreement, which is used to document multiple or complex undertakings where the effects may not be fully determined in advance. Programmatic agreements are also used to document federal agency programs and routine maintenance. So it's essentially like a guidebook for or an instruction manual for how to complete Section 106 projects that meet certain conditions or definitions. You can learn more about guidance on drafting and executing agreement documents with our office in this workshop that I provided in May of 2024. That's available on our YouTube channel. In addition to agreement document or programmatic agreements that can define an alternative way for an agency to handle their Section 106 process, there are some other alternatives defined by the Advisory Council. So that again includes programmatic agreements, which can also include nationwide programmatic agreements, which are more broad. Most programmatic agreements would be at the state or tribal level, so they would be an agreement with the SHPO, for instance, for how the agency will work with the SHPO to address certain types of projects. But there are also other alternatives that you can learn much more about on the Advisory Council's website. These include exempted categories, standard treatments, program comments, which are very similar to programmatic agreements, and alternate procedures. So there are a number of program alternatives, programmatic agreements that you can find and apply at the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation's website. The Federal Communications Commission has a couple of agreement documents that help to streamline FCC projects. You can see there are exempted categories also. There's the interstate highway system exemption, natural gas pipelines exemption, electric vehicle supply equipment exemptions, etc. You can find all of these alternatives on the Advisory Council's website. And then there are some large program comments. An agency can request the Advisory Council's comment on a category of undertakings in lieu of comments on a case-by-case basis. So this is largely how programmatic agreements work at the state level, but basically the Advisory Council can say there are certain types of activities that we think have no potential or very limited potential to cause adverse effects to historic properties. And so to streamline the Section 106 review, we'll find projects that don't require individual Section 106 review if these program comments could be applied. And then in these situations, the agency just has to document that their project falls under one of these comments, and that would not require an individual review, or there would be a special treatment that would be defined within that program comment. So there were some recent Advisory Council program comments. These included federal communication projects and a large one on housing, building, and transportation undertakings, which were signed last year. You can find more information on those at the Advisory Council's website. At this point in the presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit about how to submit a project for our review at the Oklahoma State Historic Preservation Office. So I'll also direct your attention to some of our handouts. I've included our Oklahoma SHPO consultation form, our Oklahoma SHPO Section 106 quick guide, our SHPO map checklist. Those documents should give you more detailed information on what we need to receive in order to complete your review. Our office does require hard copy submittals. So we need to receive a physical copy that can be hand delivered or mailed to our office. Your submittal should include a cover letter that includes the following information: complete contact information so that we can contact whoever is submitting the project, but also the federal agency responsible for the project if they're not the same entity or person. Um, the full information on the funding or licensing or permitting program through the federal government so that we understand and can confirm that this is a project subject to our review under Section 106. Do include whatever authority you have to consult if you're consulting on behalf of a federal agency. A brief description of your project. It does not have to be incredibly detailed depending on the size and scope of your project. You may be able to say simply, we're doing rehabilitation on a home that was constructed in 2012. That's a very simple project for us to review. But it may be complicated. So if you have a large transmission line rebuild, you may have sections of your project which are within areas that have been previously excavated, disturbed for construction of certain infrastructure, but you may have other portions of your project which will create new disturbance. So that information is going to be critical for us to figure out if there are need for archaeological surveys or field inspections at portions of the project to help us to evaluate and comment on the area of potential effect, etc. So please provide a description of your project that is appropriate for the project itself. You don't have to give us all of the details of the wallpaper or paint that you're going to use in a rehabilitation of a building that's not even of age, but please do provide information if there to clarify if there's going to be ground disturbance. That will be necessary for us to evaluate the project. Make sure you include precise location information. This will include the county, the legal location of the project. That would be your township and range and section, GPS coordinates or a street address, something so that we can pinpoint where the project is happening, and note whether or not your project area of potential effect is vacant land or if there are resources or properties present within it. If you have buildings or bridges or other structures in your area of potential effect that are less than 45 years of age, all we need to know is their addresses or locations and when they were constructed. If there are buildings or structures in your area of potential effect that are 45 years old or older, then we do need to know, we do need to receive our historic preservation resource identification form for those buildings or structures, or bridge forms if they're bridges. We would need a map showing your project location and the boundaries of your area of potential effect. This tells us what the area you're expecting us to review is and helps us to evaluate whether we think that your area of potential effect is appropriate for a project, but also it helps us to understand what your project effects are likely to be. Please do enclose copies of any new or updated archaeological site forms if applicable. And if you're referencing an ongoing or a prior project, include our file number. This helps us to identify all of the previous consultation for your project and to quickly be able to address the new information. Here's our OKSHPO consultation form. You can find it on our website. I've included the link in the handouts. This form is not mandatory at this time, though maybe in the future, and it's just a really helpful form for us to have all the information that we are likely to need for most projects in a way that we can easily find and respond to. I want to note that when you're submitting for our review, the Oklahoma SHPO and the Oklahoma Archaeological Survey have a cooperative agreement through a memorandum of understanding that the Oklahoma Archaeological Survey will maintain the Oklahoma Archaeological Site Files and assist our office by commenting on project effects to pre-contact archaeological resources. So for this reason, for most projects, in addition to sending your documentation to our office at the Oklahoma State Historic Preservation Office, you'll also need to send it to the Oklahoma Archaeological Survey for their review. This is their address. You can find their website at the bottom of your screen, and you can contact them for additional questions if you have any, or our office. We're, of course, also happy to help. Our office and the Oklahoma Archaeological Survey have 30 calendar days from receipt of adequate documentation to respond to Section 106 requests, and we will respond. If you haven't received a timely response, please reach out to confirm that we received your submittal. Um, if your submittal wasn't received by our office or by consulting parties, then you technically have not met your obligations under Section 106. And please note that the 30-day clock begins the date documentation is received in our office. And I'll also note that our office has worked really hard to complete reviews in a much shorter time. We do have those 30 days, but most of our reviews are completed much more quickly. Emergency reviews that the federal agency determines comply with the Executive Order 14156 are accepted via email. That email needs to go for our office to section 106 at history.ok.gov. And for OAS's review, it needs to go to 2 addresses simultaneously to ensure that it is that it reaches the folks it needs to. The subject line should include national energy emergency, and the email must be submitted by the federal agency or their delegated authority. And OKSHPO and OAS will respond in their allotted time, which for these emergency reviews is 7 days. And so that is all the information that I have in this presentation, but I'm very happy to take any questions. Thank you for attending.